Report number 2 concerned the flotilla. And since I'm afraid I'll run out of time a bit, I'm assuming that you're going to know about the flotilla, what happened there. One of the investigators at the UN, first of all, the Human Rights Council created this investigation within 48 hours of the attack. One of the investigators was the legal partner of the self-described legal advisor to Palestine, and their law offices conducted the legal work supporting a unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state. But that didn't stop this Mr. De Silva from claiming he was starting without, in his words, any preconceptions. His bias, however, occasionally peeked through. He told the Human Rights Council just 2 weeks ago on September the 28th, and I'm quoting him, "Even if bin Laden himself was on board the Mavi Marmara," he declared, referring to the vessel where the deaths occurred, "it wouldn't have made the blockade legal." The report of this cabal says the committee couldn't trust the Israeli video evidence and based its conclusions on the supposedly neutral eyewitness accounts of the blockade runners. So they called the thugs who attacked and wounded Israeli soldiers who barely escaped with their lives persons who were genuinely committed to the spirit of humanitarianism. Israel, on the other hand, was only interested in a publicity stunt, they said. Hamas immediately hailed the contents of the report on the massacre perpetrated by the Zionist forces, etc. The Human Rights Council bestowed its highest praise on the flotilla investigation. It sent the report to the General Assembly. It required the UN High Commissioner to produce a new report on its implementation and put the issue back on the agenda for the next council meeting. When the whole council session was over, the council had spent the same amount of time on its agenda devoted only to Israel bashing than on its one agenda item on human rights situations that require the council's attention in all other 191 countries. So the question is, where were the Americans? Well, they were in a bit of between a rock and a hard place, because after all, it's President Obama that insisted that Israel's investigation of the flotilla event was not good enough. He pushed Israel for the first time to submit Israeli Defense Forces to a UN Secretary General's investigation of the event. Such a move would certainly spell the end of an Obama presidency should he ever agree to put the American armed forces under a similar knife. To appreciate the depravity of what happens to the democratic state of Israel in this context, in the context of its efforts for self-defense, consider how the Council handled real emergency situations of human rights in the rest of the world. Essentially, in a nutshell, they produced 2 resolutions on Israel, one on technical assistance to Somalia and another one to technical assistance to Cambodia, and another one in Sudan congratulating it for its elections, its recent elections, which brought President Bashir, who's under indictment by the International Criminal Court for genocide, back to power after 21 years. They didn't even, so that the tally then is 2 on Israel, 3 for everybody else, and none for the other 188 countries, not even for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, between July 30th and August 3, in 4 days, more than 240 men, women, and children were raped, 20 miles from a UN base, which was alerted to the start of the violence and did nothing to stop it. The UN Council could have acted. They could have declared a special session. They could have had since the current session began in September, they could have had an urgent debate. They could have had an investigation. They could have adopted a resolution. They could have had adopted a presidential statement. After all, in a mere 4 years, they've had 6 special sessions on Israel, 1 6-hour urgent special debate, 1 permanent investigator, 2 ongoing investigations of committees, and a resolution within 48 hours of the flotilla episode on Israel. But it did none of the above. In the face of the Council inaction, others organized what they call a side event at lunchtime, in a room with no cameras, no recordings, and no subsequent press release on what had taken place. But what did Ambassador Donoghue say to the press? And I'm quoting her. "I welcome the Council's engagement on the issue of the mass rapes in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This showed the Council's ability to react to real events in real time," this is 2 months later, "and to contribute its voice to the important issue." Now, the State Department website, first of all, of course, none of that was actually fact, but the State Department website actually attaches to her comment a photo of the council chamber full of delegates. But the meeting never took place in the council chamber because it wasn't allowed to be there, and the room they could actually get was half empty. While the issue of mass rapes which had taken place could not garner a statement from the council of any kind, the Koran burning that never happened in Florida was given a different reception. On September the 30th, the president of the council announced, I'm quoting him, he had been empowered by the agreement of all council members to issue a formal statement in view of the growing number of instances of religious intolerance, such as conflating a religion with terrorism and desecrating or destroying holy books. The council took aim at the Koran burning episode, and he says, condemns recent instances of religious intolerance and demands practical steps to end such intolerance. Agreement on practical steps to end such intolerance, such as gang raping the DRC's women and children, however, was beyond them. Despite all this, at the end of the session, the Obama administration representatives claimed victory. There are 3 reasons for this. The first is there were some successes. In particular, the Council created the first ever UN Special Rapporteur or investigator on the freedom of association and assembly. The Council created a new working group to monitor discrimination against women in law and practice. I could go in detail to what's the problem with these various things, but it would go into too much detail. Basically, Ambassador Donoghue was asked whether these people would ever get inside, for example, the countries where it mattered most, Iran, China, Cuba. And she said, in her words, do you expect, she said, let's put it this way, if the special rapporteur was not in place, there would be no opportunity to test the sincerity of their words. Well, I mean, the point is that that's not what's supposed to be the end game of the council. We know that they're insincere. The point is, what do they do after they become aware of it? The second reason that the Ambassador Donoghue declared that the human rights, these are her words, the Human Rights Council made historic progress in this session in advancing the human rights defenders throughout the world, was the relative priority the administration is evidently placing on the human rights of Israelis. Progress for other groups trumps protection of Jews at the forefront of Jewish self-determination. Apparently, it is more important to take one step forward for everybody else, even though providing the Council with the credibility of an American presence, American taxpayer dollars, and an American cheering section for every inch in the right direction contributes to the demonization of the Jewish people and profoundly threatens the welfare of the Jewish state. In other words, for this administration, Israel may not deserve the discrimination and the nature and extent of the condemnation, but poor treatment of Israel is a price worth paying for progress on other fronts. The NGO Human Rights Watch representative once put it this way, and I'm quoting them, "It would be a mistake to judge the Council on the basis of its actions on the occupied Palestinian territories." In other words, to judge the Council, treating the Jewish state differently than all other countries is a problem only for a small proportion of the world's population. For Jews to denounce the whole just because they are given the short end of the stick would be narrow-minded, callous, and parochial. Of course, the same approach was never suggested by human rights organizations to South African blacks and the anti-apartheid movement, and for good reason. The road to hell is paved with the cries of the insignificant, the marginal, and the irrelevant. The third reason of this administration has joined the Council, touts its progress as historic, and will stay put regardless of what happens to Israel, is the most disturbing of all. The anti-Israel politics of the UN is perceived as providing an important advantage in U.S.-Israel relations, far outweighing any disadvantage to human rights. The desirability of a U.S. vote against the anti-Israel mob at the United Nations is now a bargaining chip. We currently have some striking evidence of this cold calculation. Reliable reports indicate that the letter currently being waved by this administration in front of the Netanyahu government as an incentive to extend the settlement moratorium promises that the United States will veto anti-Israeli resolutions at the UN Security Council relating to the Arab-Israeli peace process for 1 year. In more straightforward terms, the US government is currently threatening the state of Israel that it will give the UN hordes free rein of the $20 billion a year enterprise, $5 billion of which comes from you, unless Israel follows instructions. It is no longer true that the UN-led effort to demonize and destroy the state of Israel is so wrong in and of itself and so harmful to the fundamental interests of the United States that a negative US vote is a moral imperative, not a political weapon to be used against an ally. In last month's New York Times article by Ambassador Donahue, she defended the Obama administration's engagement strategy at the UN Human Rights Council with these words: "If we do not sit at the table with others and do the work necessary to influence the process, US values and priorities will not be reflected in the outcome," end of quote. For the Jewish people, US values are not reflected in the outcome. For those who care about equality and non-discrimination, US values are not reflected in the outcome. For those whose priorities are something else, we must hope that they learn the lessons of history before it is too late. For the inequality of Jews cannot be quarantined. It perverts priorities and purposes. Fairness, equality, and human dignity cannot be built on the inequality of the few. Equality is an end in itself, and the discrimination and demonization of the Jewish state and the Jewish people is not just an extraneous flaw. It subverts the very foundation of human rights and the foundation of the United States. So Andrea urged me to be constructive and suggest elements of a concrete action plan. The address for doing something about the daily abominations at the United Nations is 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Wonderful. Gerald just said she's so wonderful. Great going. Wow.